Hello everyone, how are you? My name is Bernard Purley. I am from Tobic First Nation and I am Maliseet. Now one of the things that I was asked to do was talk about language and territory. And one of the things that I do as a linguistic anthropologist is to examine the causes for language endangerment and language extinction, but also to look at how communities are working towards revitalizing their languages and revitalizing their cultural practices as well. One of the most important aspects of the work that I do as a native linguist is to focus on how we reintegrate the language with the culture, with the landscape, and with our spiritual and religious practices. And so my introduction today was in Maliseet, and Maliseet is itself a misnomer. We call ourselves the Wolastoqiyik, and what that means, according to some, is that we are the people of the beautiful river. But if you look at the grammar and the morphology of the word Wolastoqiyik, one of the most important things we can recognize is that rather than beautiful river, what it actually does mean is it is a placid river. And so the most important aspect of the name is that we also, as a people, belong to the river. The river does not belong to us. And so this is an important insight when we think about how indigenous languages and indigenous cultures are embedded in particular kinds of landscapes. And so when I say that I am Maliseet, I am using somebody else's term. But when I say I'm Wolastoqiyik, then that is a local term, but it's also a term that recognizes a particular kind of relationship to the landscape. So territory is extremely important in how we conceive of the language, the culture, the religion, as well as our landscape. One of the most important aspects of how I look at language revitalization is not to think about language as the most important aspect of what needs to be coded and stored on either technological devices or in terms of permanent forms such as texts. What I'm looking at rather is we need to remember that the relationships that produce language are more important. If you save the language as a document or as an audio file or even a video file, what you've done is preserved an artifact of the spoken language, the living language. And so for me, one of the things that I want to do is concentrate on how we reintegrate the relationships that define language. If we can focus on how people come together to use the language, then what happens is that if we record those moments of social interaction, then we also have a record of the speech. So the speech, without the context of it being spoken, is going to miss an important aspect of the relationships. And this is what David Harrison was talking about in his 2007 text, When Languages Die. One of the most important aspects of his work was to look at how the languages encode particular kinds of knowledge acquired over eons in particular landscapes. And so when we think about a language, what we need to recognize in terms of the indigenous languages is how that really encodes those kinds of long-term experiences. And so not only is knowledge being lost, it's experience in particular landscapes that is being lost. And one of the most important aspects of the work that I'm doing is to also recognize that as we preserve these languages, as we revitalize the relationships, what we're also doing is recognizing that these are survival strategies that indigenous peoples have developed over centuries in particular landscapes. And this is where the work that I'm doing and other Native scholars and indigenous communities becomes so important, because when we think about the looming crisis that we call climate change, we're going to need all that knowledge in order to be able to survive the kinds of transformations that are going to happen to all of us when we're dealing with climate change. And so for me, it's the linkage between language, culture, and landscape that becomes important. You don't save one without saving the others. And so in closing, I'd like you to think about three important questions as you think about, where you are in your own particular landscapes. I'd like you to think about the kinds of soundscape that you're living in. What are the sounds of the languages in that particular landscape, and how does it reflect the kinds of emplacement of a particular language and people in a particular landscape? The second thing I'd like you to think about is when you think about the kind of semiotics of space, language is not just one aspect of a linguistic landscape, it's the relationships. It's not just the signage that we produce, but it's also the sounds that we hear in the landscape. And so as you think about these landscapes, think about all your senses as you begin to understand and appreciate the landscape that you're in. So language is more about the semiotics of place rather than just a code about the landscape. And the third question I'd like you to think about as you think about language and territory is to think about the lessons we can learn from Indigenous communities as they grapple with the first aspects of climate change. And so over 500 years, Native peoples in North America had to deal with dramatic changes in their landscapes. And so they had to choose what was important in terms of continuity, but also to develop strategies to adjusting to new landscapes. We're all going to need those particular kinds of skills as we face the onslaught of climate change in upcoming decades. Thank you for listening.